Welcome again, listeners, to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, and streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. We also syndicated on the John Menadue Pearls and Irritations online. Our program is Innovation Talk. I'm Michael Lester. Australia's been travelling and continues to travel a long, hard and rocky road towards, let's say, efficient, effective and equitable responses to climate change. It's now 17 years since we had the landmark government commissioned reviews from Professor Ross Garnaut of climate change policies, 2007, 2008. And it was a few years after that, when Tony Abbott came to power in 2013, that what had been operating as a pretty effective emissions trading system and so-called carbon tax was actually scrapped. It seems that since then, we've struggled to put in place decent and effective and, as I say, efficient policies on climate change. It's been due to a pretty toxic political environment over that time. And meanwhile, in that time too, we as a country have struggled for the last decade or so to maintain our prosperity and living standards and growth and productivity as a society, as an economy. And that continues to be a challenge to this day. We're going to be talking with our guest, Professor Ross Garnaut, whose new book, Let's Tax Carbon and Other Ideas for a Better Australia, has just been published by Black Ink Trobe Press. Ross is arguably Australia's most preeminent and foresightful and prescient economic contributor to policies, and he has been for 5 decades through the early periods of major structural reform in the Australian economy, and latterly, as I say, since his engagement in the issues of climate and energy in 2007. Since then, he's produced a series of 5 books, the latest of which we're going to be talking today, Let's Tax Carbon. Ross is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Melbourne University these days, and all his contributions have been recognised by the highest order of Australia, the Companion Order of Australia. So look, thank you very much, Ross, for taking time to join us here on Radio Northern Beaches.
Very good to be with you and your listeners again, Michael.
Ross, my reading of this book is that you've made a very elegant and comprehensive reframing almost of the more conventional discussions that we've had about climate change and particularly the carbon tax, in that you're reframing it within the context of contributing to this long period of stagnant economic performance and living standards in Australia. And you set out in your book a very broad agenda of major reform tasks, to which you argue that the response to climate change and energy, including a carbon tax, are quite fundamental. Is that a fair reading?
I think it is, Michael. I don't think it's any coincidence that Australia's worst ever decade of economic performance measured as growth in living standards for ordinary Australians has been the decade since Tony Abbott got rid of carbon pricing. Australia's dog days began in 2013. Since then, we've had almost no growth in output per person. We've actually had a decline in real wages. That hasn't happened over a decade before in Australian history. It didn't happen 29 to 39, a period that covered the Great Depression. So it's been an awful decade. That's the reason I think we've got such a grumpy electorate. People don't think a lot about the causes of stagnation of their living standards, but they know the reality of it, and it goes on and on. 2013 and the election of Tony Abbott and the promise of getting rid of efficient, economically and environmentally efficient carbon pricing was a landmark in 2 ways. First, it ushered in a decade of incoherence in energy and climate policies, and we're still getting more of that with what the current government's trying to do, being contested by an opposition that wants to build government-owned nuclear power stations decades in the future, diverting us from the things we've got to do right now. So incoherence in energy policy and instability in an important area of the economy is one reason, one of several reasons for the stagnation of living standards since Tony Abbott's election in 2013. The other reason it's a landmark is that that 2013 election saw corporate vested interests investing heavily in politics to avoid measures that had been judged to be in the public interest, but which were against their corporate interests. There were huge business campaigns against carbon pricing. and the emissions trading scheme, and also against implementation of the Henry Tax Review's recommendations on taxation of mineral rents. The success of those corporate interests encouraged vested interests in general to the view that by investing in politics, they could destroy public interest policies if they diverged from their private interests. And we haven't yet recovered from that. We've had a decade of stagnation of living standards, and I fear that we've got much more to come unless we can break that knot that was tied in 2013, unless we can get back to governments being able to implement policies in the national interest, even if they hurt some private interests. And amongst these is a return to carbon pricing.
At the heart, I think, of your discussion and analysis is there that you argue that there's too much corporate power because there's no real competition, in a sense, in our markets, and the powerful interests that dominate extract what are called economic rents, that these need to be addressed and tackled as part of a structural transformation.
Yes, that's a bit of a theme of the book. Economic rents are generated whenever the absence of competition allows companies to achieve returns on investment in excess of the returns that are necessary to attract investment to business activities. They persist when there is some kind of monopoly. Sometimes monopoly is inevitable. For example, there's a natural monopoly in transmission lines for electricity. You don't want competition with 6 different transmission lines being run down your street. So sometimes it's economically efficient to have monopoly. When that's the case, you do have to have government, either government ownership or government regulation of investment and rates of return. Also, you get monopoly rents in exploitation of a rich mineral deposit. And again, competition is not efficient. 170 years ago, we had the Victorian and New South Wales gold rushes, and rich mineral deposits were discovered, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people rushed in to start mining them. We could have got that amount of gold out with a fraction of the labour if we'd given a couple of large companies a monopoly control of that. And they would have got even more gold and much lower costs. They would have earned economic rent. That might have been a good thing to do, might have been economically efficient, but it wouldn't be good for the society unless those rents were taxed by the governments and redistributed to the community. That's mineral rent. You also get rents from monopoly. If a small number of firms are able to control a market and avoid competition between each other, then they can charge prices that give them higher rates of return than are necessary to attract business investment to economic activities. So there are lots of different sources of economic rents, and each has its own remedy. Sometimes it's sufficient to let the monopoly exist, but to make sure that the community is able to benefit from any increase in economic efficiency through government taxing the rents and spending them for the good of the community. In Australia, economic rents have become a much bigger part of the economy. One reason is the increased dominance of mining and mineral rents in the economy. Note that there have been periods in recent times when mining, contributing only about 2% of employment in Australia, has generated more profits than the whole of the rest of the economy, all of the rest of business in all the other sectors of the economy. And also, we've shared a phenomenon that's been important all over the world, and that is the rise of monopolies in information technology. We spend an increasing proportion of our incomes every year on the network services of the information technology platforms. Their profits grow. They've become a very large part of the global economy. The big corporates on the American stock exchanges are the network companies. They are able to earn these huge incomes with relatively little investment and relatively little employment. There's huge economic rents in those. And once you've established a network, it's very hard for someone else to break in and establish a competing network. Someone who's got hundreds of millions of customers, so all of those customers in a network benefit from the large number of participants in the network. They can all communicate amongst each other. A new participant in that industry would have to suffer low levels of activity, probably business losses, for a very long time, while the numbers of customers built up to levels that generated those network economies. And so economic rent in information technology is becoming very important in the whole world economy, and Australia is sharing that. And that's adding to the role of monopoly in the mining sector, monopoly rents, resource rents in the mining sector, and adding to the tendency that Australia has, as a relatively small economy, geographically dispersed amongst a number of regional markets, to have monopoly in a provision of a wide range of services.
Central to your view, I believe, of and your work over these many years now, 17, nearly 20 years, on not only climate change, but energy, is what you have presented very elegantly in a particular book, but throughout your work, as the opportunity for Australia here, not only to tackle climate change, but to totally restructure our economy for future sustainable prosperity with full employment, productivity, and equity. It's a big vision that relates climate change as an opportunity to structural transformation. But you also make a big point that one of the important roads to this is a very important role for the private sector. But more importantly, you say that we've got to get the balance right between government interventions, ad hoc interventions to do this and to do that, and the market exchange. And you argue that we haven't really got that balance right, do you?
That's right, Michael. And you're talking about what I call the superpower opportunity. In my book 5 years ago, we spoke on this program about that at the time. But Australia has the opportunity to be the superpower economically of the zero carbon world economy. We're very important in the world economy of fossil carbon. If you take coal and natural gas together, or natural and coal seam gas together, we're the world's largest export, coal and gas taken together, liquefied natural gas taken together. We've been, in terms of our incomes, quite a big beneficiary of that, although we could have been a bigger beneficiary, much bigger, with efficient taxation of resource rents. Now, that's just part of a general story in the fossil carbon economy. The distribution of world oil and gas and coal resources is completely unlike the distribution of demand for these things. The densely populated, high-income, highly industrialized economies of Northeast Asia and Europe have much less than their share of fossil carbon. And so industrialization, high incomes have only been possible in Europe and Northeast Asia. By Northeast Asia, I mean China, Japan, Korea, because of huge international trade going from the resource-rich to the resource-poor economies. Exports from the Middle East and the Emirates, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, of liquefied natural gas, coal, Australia the big one, and for thermal coal for power generation, Indonesia. Well, the imbalance between resources and demand is even greater in the emerging zero carbon economy. Every country's got some sun and wind, but the quality of these resources is very different in different countries. You need a lot of land to deploy these renewable energy resources. Even if you've got good solar resources, you can only deploy them at scale if you've got relatively underutilized land, economically low-value land to put it on. And you don't have that in Northeast Asia and Europe. Germany's had a lot of development of solar and wind in the 21st century. In the first decade of this century, Germany had more solar power generation than any other country. But the land available for these activities, and in any case, the solar is nowhere near as good in Germany as in Australia and some other countries. The extreme cases are Japan and Korea. Also, the economies of Taiwan and Singapore, where they will not even be able to generate at reasonable cost the renewable energy that's necessary to even to meet the demand for electricity that must be met from local sources to keep the lights on, keep batteries in the cars full, keep hospitals going, control temperature through air conditioning and so on. So they will be overwhelmingly dependent on imports of energy in the zero carbon world as they were in the fossil carbon world, and they have to be imports of renewable energy or products embodying that in the zero carbon world. Now, amongst suppliers, Australia's position is much more dominant internationally in the zero carbon world than it was in the fossil carbon world. There are other economies that have good combinations of solar and wind resources. No one's got better resources than us. Central Queensland, inside the Great Divide, wonderful sun and wind, and the wind nicely anti-correlated with the sun, blowing much more strongly at night time. The west-facing coasts of South Australia and the southern half of Western Australia have extraordinarily good wind resources, and there are pretty good solar resources near there. There's nothing better than right across the continent near the Tropic of Capricorn in Australia. No one's got better resource quality than us, and we've got far bigger availability of land for deployment in generation of renewable energy. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, the southwest of Africa, Namibia and bits of South Africa, some of Chile. There are a few other places on Earth that have got pretty good combinations of solar and wind, but they're small compared with Australia. You can fit Saudi Arabia into New South Wales, east of Broken Hill. That means that we will be much more dominant as an exporter of zero carbon energy in the new zero carbon world than we were in the world of coal and gas. There's one other difference between the new and the old worlds. You can transport coal very cheaply from the rich fields of Queensland and New South Wales in Japan or Korea or China, the places that don't have coal and have big industrial demand. Costs no more to use Australian coal from Queensland or New South Wales in Shanghai or Kobe or Busan than it does to use that same coal in Whyalla in steelworks in South Australia. Cheap to transport coal internationally. It's not cheap to transport renewable energy.
Our guest here on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beach is Professor Ross Garnaut. We're discussing his latest book, Let's Tax Carbon and Other Ideas for a Better Australia. To be clear, this vision of yours, as I understand it, of the superpower opportunities is not so much that we would be a direct exporter, I think, as you're saying, of renewable energy per se, but that we would embed it into transformation in a significant way of our rich mineral commodities, and that we would become, the shipper of zero carbon products to the world. And on this, we could build our future prosperity. But at the heart of this, too, is a discussion of public policy about the price of carbon that might promote the right actions by private industry players to take advantage of these opportunities. And you talk about the importance of pricing carbon for the social costs and providing a green premium for zero carbon energy exports. What's this green premium and how does it relate to a carbon price?
It's basic economics, really, Michael. Economics is always understood. Even the extreme free market economists like von Hayek and Friedman understood that if one person or company undertakes economic activity that damages others, it should pay for that. It should either be stopped from doing it or should pay for it. That's called an economic external diseconomy, damage that one company through its business activities does to others. Well, anyone who emits carbon is doing damage to other people, adding up to huge damage. Every ton of carbon dioxide that goes in the air increases that damage. If you don't pay for that damage, you're being subsidized. You're reducing welfare of others and not paying for it. You're not paying the true cost of what you do. For an efficient market economy, companies have to pay for the damage they do others. And if they pay the social cost of carbon, then right now it would be economic to process in Australia using renewable energy, our iron ore, our aluminium, our other minerals that currently are sent overseas to be turned into metals with high emissions using coal, sometimes our own coal.
These arguments about particularly the economic efficiency of that have been on the agenda for a long time, since day one in this very difficult, long, hard road of 20 years of toxic debate, and have not really prevailed and been rejected politically, and no one seems prepared to buy into it, even though most economists seem to agree. In particular, you've actually rejigged this a bit, have you, into something rather than an emissions trading scheme, which we had operating successfully a couple of years and generating a lot of government revenue for reform and investment. You've suggested a carbon solutions levy. Now, what is the difference between this approach of a carbon solutions levy in the context of economic transformation compared to the old ideas we had of the economic emissions trading scheme price?
Rod Sims, chairman of the Superpower Institute, and I, as a director of the Superpower Institute, that's a philanthropically funded think tank, we put the carbon pricing back on the agenda in a National Press Club joint address last February. And we did that because it's becoming increasingly clear that mucking around with lots of interventions, in particular businesses, is starting to cost the economy a lot, and is not getting the job done of getting emissions down at a necessary rate and providing incentives for building the zero carbon economy. The scheme that Julia Gillard's government legislated in the minority government of 2010 to 2013 worked very well. It was economically efficient, it was equitable. The very large revenues from the carbon price were spent on increasing the tax-free threshold and adjusting social security payments. No one on low or middle income had a lower income as a result of carbon pricing. Industries weren't damaged because there were very good arrangements for supporting emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries, ways that did not discourage reduction of emissions. So it worked very well, and it'd be good now. But Rod Sims and I are suggesting an alternative that in current circumstances would be even better. Now, if we went back to the emissions trading scheme of 2012 to 2014, that would be fine too. But we think that the carbon solutions levy would be even better. First, it's simpler. You'd only be applying it at about 100 points of administration, the points of production of coal and natural gas, or of imports across the ports. Administratively much simpler. It would raise a lot of revenue. It would raise revenue on our exports as well. You would exempt countries that had their own schemes for putting a price on carbon, and which rewarded Australian exporters of zero carbon goods, green iron, green aluminium and so on, with higher prices because they themselves were putting a price on carbon and increasing the cost of goods produced with carbon emissions. Europe's already doing that. China's doing it, but on currently a much lower carbon price, about the carbon price now that Australia had in 2014 when Tony Abbott got rid of it. Japan and Korea are engaged in discussions of policy that could lead to higher prices for higher value for exports of goods with no carbon than for their competitors made from coal and gas and oil. So we would exempt any country that had its own arrangements that gave Australia higher prices for zero carbon goods. That's the way the world is probably going to head, and we think that putting this levy in place would accelerate that change. It would also yield a very large amount of revenue, which could be used to fund tax reform, which could be used to fund support for infrastructure for the new superpower industries, which could be used more generally for increasing productivity through necessary public investment. So we're not saying that what was in place 2012 to 2014 wasn't effective. It was a very good set of arrangements, but we've put on the table something that's simpler, would help to deal with our budget problems and encourage the emergence of higher prices for Australia's zero carbon goods in the rest of the world.
Well, thank you. As we conclude here on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches with our guest, Professor Ross Garnaut, talking about his latest book, Let's Tax Carbon and Other Ideas for a Better Australia. So in conclusion, if I'm reading you right and hearing you right, at the heart of your case is you're linking climate change action and meeting our goals there, which we haven't been meeting particularly well, but aligning that with the opportunity to substantially transform the Australian economy into a net zero carbon economy, which is exporting net zero products to the world through private sector activity. Key to that, I think you argue, is that it's unlikely that we can suitably otherwise transform our economy and recover from this 10 years of stagnation economically and living standards without doing this transformation. And you say the key to that is pricing carbon correctly. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. But what about the politics? You seem to take some, I think you call it a saving grace, that there's high community interest in all these issues. But what about leadership politically to do this? Can we get any substantial change without crisis?
We're getting some change without prices through government support of zero carbon activity. So you can make some progress, but we won't get to the full utilisation of the opportunity without carbon pricing. And it's really important that we do. This is necessary to end the decade of stagnation of living standards, to bring an end to the dog days, to bring an end to the worst decade for growth of living standards that Australia's ever had. It's impossible politically in current circumstances for governments or oppositions to advocate carbon pricing, but I think that living with continued stagnation of living standards will turn out to be even more impossible.
Well, look, thank you very much, Ross, for this contribution in your book, Let's Tax Carbon, which, as I say, I read fundamentally as a reframing of the long and difficult road we've tried to travel unsuccessfully on climate change policies by linking it centrally, to, as you say, maintaining Australian living standards going forward that we've not been able to do in the last 10 years. You sort of mainstream the carbon tax issue into that and beyond just climate change, which is important in itself. Thank you very much, Professor Ross Garnaut from University of Melbourne Economics and also of the Superpower Institute. And thanks again, Ross, for taking the time to join us on Radio Northern Beaches.
And thanks to you and your interest and your listeners' interest, Michael.
Cheers.